So we are live. I would like to welcome everyone either back or for the first time to this evening's class, King Solomon and his demons, with Rabbi David Silber. So without further ado, Rabbi Silber.
Okay, thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. The plan is that we'll this week look at a couple of sources, and starting next week, we'll get to Shromo and his demons, and we'll conclude. The concluding sessions will be on. Always like to end on an upbeat note. Shromo as the builder of the Beit HaMikdash, the temple builder, and Solomon's prayer, which is very powerful prayer. That's the plan for the remainder. This evening, I want to go back. We started last week with a extremely interesting Gemara in Shabbat on Daf Lamed 30a. It was. We may go back there, but I wanted to look at a different Gemara in Shabbat. Start with that, and that's the Gemara on Daf Nun Vav Amud Bet. I believe it's page 6 in the sources. This is a long Gemara, which the first part of which is even more famous. It's the Gemara that speaks about whoever says David sinned is mistaken. And there's a list of people about whom, if one says they sinned, you are mistaken. Sons of Eli, Shmuel, etc., David, Reuven. And in that very same sugya, we get to someone else who, if you say he sinned, you're making a mistake. None other than the hero of this class, which is Shromo. So I want to look at this Gemara, and you all have it on page 6. So let's see. You have I'll read the Hebrew, and you have also the translation right there. And the Gemara starts the same way. Rabbi Shmuel bar Nachmoni, Rabbi Yonatan. Shmuel bar Nachmoni said in the name of Yonatan, Ka Omer Shlomo Chata Eino Ela Toeh. Whoever says that Solomon sinned is mistaken. Shenemar, and they quote a verse in the book of Melachim. It says that V'lo haya levavo shalem im Hashem Elohav ki levav David aviv. His heart was not whole or perfect with God, as was his father David. From which the Gemara infers ki levav David hu delo hava. He wasn't as good as David. He wasn't perfect. But he wasn't a sinner either. From the fact that he says he wasn't as good as David, David, of course, in the book of Melachim is held up to be the standard for the pious king. We're not talking about the David that appears in the book of Shmuel. One might arrive at different conclusions, but the David of Melachim is held up as the ideal king. He wasn't as good as David. Okay, wasn't as good as David. That doesn't mean he's a sinner. So anybody who thinks he might have sinned is mistaken. That's how the Gemara begins. It's the same Shmuel bar Nachmoni, and it's the same as all the previous statements about those people that some might thought have sinned, but they're mistaken. So the Gemara continues. Elamani mikayem vayhi liyet zikna ziknat Shlomo nashav hituat levavo. So what do you do with the other verse in the book of Melachim? Chapter 11, and when he became old, his wives caused him to stray. His wives turned his heart away. Shlomo has 1,000 wives, foreign women for the most part, and it says they caused his heart to turn astray. That sounds like he perhaps did sin. Mar says, no problem. Ahik Rabbi Natan, to Rabbi Natan Rami. But we haven't, Rabbi Natan supplies us with the answer. Because Rabbi Natan asked the question, a contradiction. Rami is a contradiction of two equal sources. Ketiv vahi liyeh ziknat Shlomo nashav hituat levavo. So v'haketiv kilvav David aviv hu delo hava mechtanami lo chata. We have a contradiction. What exactly the contradiction we just saw? It says he's not as good as David. Okay, but he's not a sinner. Over here it says, it says that in his old age the women turned his heart astray. So it says he turned his heart astray to follow foreign gods. That is a sin. says, "L'olechet v'lo halach." Okay, they tried to cause him to go astray, but he didn't go astray. They enticed him, but he didn't really do it. That's Rabbi Natan's solution to the contradiction between the two verses. And therefore, that suggests to us that he actually didn't sin. And if you say he sinned, you're making a mistake. Okay, now the Gemara continues. Got to scroll down some more. No, we'll scroll it down. Yeah, fine. So, fine. Gemara says, V'aktiv, how can you say that he meant to do it but didn't do it? V'aktiv oz yivneh Shlomo bama l'chmo shikutz moav. Says then Shlomo built a bama, an altar, to Chemosh. Chemosh is the god of Moab. So the Gemara answers, Bikesh livnot bana, means he thought to build it, but he didn't actually build it. The Gemara says, Elomeyata, can that be so? Oz yivneh, scroll down. Oz yivneh, scroll down, Noah. Yeah. That's it. Oz yivneh Yoshua mizbeach Hashem. That says then Yoshua built a mizbeach, an altar to God. Shebikesh livnot v'lo bana. Can you say that? Elod debana. It means he built it. He built an altar. Hachinami debana. So he did build it. So he did sin. Elod kedetanya. We have a different answer. Keep scrolling down. Elod kedetanya. Rabbi Yossi Omer. V'yet habamot asher al pnei Yerushalayim asher mimin lahar hamishcha asher bana Shlomo melch Yisrael v'yashterot shikutz tidonim and other gods. Means now we're going to try to solve the problem this way. There were altars that were built in Jerusalem near Mount of Olives, which Shlomo built for various gods. Now keep going down. Scroll down. So verse says, "Efshar ba'asa v'lo bi'aram Yehoshaphat v'lo bi'aram." How could it be that the righteous kings who came after Shlomo didn't destroy them? Ad sheba Yoshio u'bi'aram. You have to wait all the way to King Yoshio. Ve'lo kol avodah zarah she'be'eretz Yisrael asa v'Yehoshaphat bi'aram. But the other kings destroyed all the idolatry. Ela makish rishonim la'achronim. Ma'achronim lo asu v'tala behen l'shvach. So it means that Shlomo didn't actually build them. Okay, so let's see, keep going, scroll down some more. Let's see how we resolve this problem. It says, V'aktiv hayash Shlomo harabi enei Hashem. Elo mipnei shayolo limchot b'nashav v'lo micha ma'aleh olav hakatuv ki'ilu chata. Okay, so the Gemara's bottom line is that not that Shlomo actually worshipped foreign gods, but rather, not even that he built the altars himself, but rather that his wives built altars for their own gods, but the fact that he didn't prevent them from doing it, the text attributes the sin to Shlomo. If you remember, those that studied together with me when we did the David stories, the Gemara more or less comes out with the same conclusion. In other words, the whole Gemara here in Shabbat, in reality, never suggested that David didn't sin. But the point of the Gemara, actually, the Gemara knows about Sheva's story very well. The Gemara is making a different point in general about all these leaders, which is that even if he hadn't done it himself, he would be held equally responsible if he failed to prevent something from happening. Somebody who has the opportunity to prevent something from happening and allows it to happen shares equal responsibility with the one who actually does it. So that's the Gemara's so-called resolution of the problem over here. But what the Gemara here is suggesting, that at this point, the Gemara is bothered, obviously. I don't know if it actually bothers them, but the Gemara knows what it says. At the end of Shlomo's life, his wives caused him to go astray. And in fact, the kingdom is split after Shlomo's death, because Shlomo has been warned in the book of Mulachim that if you continue on King David's path, your kingship will endure. If you fail to do so, it will not. And obviously, in the eyes of the book of Mulachim, he failed to do so. So, but the Gemara is after something else, which is about kingly responsibility. So therefore, the Gemara is interested here in suggesting, not because it doesn't know what the actual meaning of the text is, of course it does, but it's here to make a point about kingship in general. So here we have this statement about Shlomo, which is embedded in the larger Agada about kings, and whoever says X sinned didn't really sin. And it turns out that they all did sin, of course, but they're being held accountable for something else anyway. Because in all of the cases, the Gemara cites, there are terrible consequences. The division of the kingship, Reuven loses the rights of the firstborn, the sons of Eli are responsible for the destruction of the priests of Shiloh, etc. David almost loses the kingship. He barely regains it after civil war, after the death of his children, etc. So that's the project the Gemara has over here. Now let's continue this very same Gemara. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Noach lo liotot tzadik. Let's scroll down. Noach lo liotot tzadik. Amar Yehuda. B'sha'ah shenasa Shromo et bat Paro. Reading the second statement there. At the time that Shlomo married Pharaoh's daughter, so she brought 1,000 different musical instruments. And she said, this is how we worship idols. He didn't prevent it. So here the Gemara is very interesting. Here the Gemara brings Pharaoh's daughter back into the picture. We saw last week that Pharaoh, 2 weeks ago, that Pharaoh's daughter is the first person mentioned when Shlomo assumes the throne. We know at the end of his life, his many wives, he has 1,000 wives, cause his heart to stray. And here the Gemara brings those two stories together. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Shmuel. And this is the main point I wanted to get to now. B'sha'ah shenasa Shlomo et bat Paro. At the time that Shlomo marries Pharaoh's daughter, Yerad Gavriel v'na'atz koneh bayam v'yolobo sirton v'yolov nivneh krach gadol shel Romi. Rabbi Yehuda said in Shmuel's name, when Shlomo married Pharaoh's daughter, the angel Gavriel descended from heaven and planted a reed in the sea. A sandbar grew around it, growing larger every year, and upon it, the city of Rome was built. The translation there, I don't know whose translation it is, that Sfaria brings, adds, which became God's instrument to punish Israel, which may or may not be true. It doesn't say that. But I don't think that's the point of the Gemara here. Mm-hmm. Gemara has a different point. Rome is responsible for the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash. So the point is, when he marries Pharaoh's daughter, which is the first thing he does actually, the angel comes down from heaven. At the moment he marries Pharaoh's daughter, it augurs the destruction of the temple. And the point that we saw a couple of weeks ago is that what these midrashim are picking up on is that there's something about the way Shlomo functions that on one hand, he's the builder of the temple. He's the builder of the temple. On the other hand, his behavior is such that even before he gets to build the temple in a sense is already destroyed. He sort of undercuts the very behavior of Shlomo, and in particular, what he does in the beginning of his life and he does at the end of his life, that is Pharaoh's daughter in particular, because that's the first thing we see with Shlomo, the daughter of Paro. That already means for the Midrash, and I think for the plain reading of the book of Mulachim, that the temple in general is doomed to fail, which is the larger project and theme of the book of Mulachim in general. It's about exile. How did we get there? But they're picking up something very interesting about Shlomo, which I think underscores what a complex character Shlomo is. That on one hand, as we saw last week, he is the fulfillment of David's kingship. But on the other hand, even before he actually takes the throne, fully is in control, it's already, the kingship is doomed not to be fully recognized, not to come to full fruition, because the very marriage of Paro's daughter is such, the very connection to Mitzrayim is such that it undercuts the kingship. The very connection to the place of slavery undercuts the idea of full autonomy, which is what kingship, at least in the book of Dvarim, is about. Let me just stop for a moment here and take questions or comments. And then I wanted to add a few points about this. But if anybody has comments or questions, I'll be happy to, about what we said just now or anything till now.
Rabbi David,
Yeah.
why does the Gemara use Rome to as the destroyer when Shlomo's temple is the one that's destroyed by Bavel?
That's true. That is very true. It's certainly the case that, I mean, I don't know why Rome specifically in this context. I'm saying Rome for the Gemara is a combination of Esav on one hand, it is the church, often the church as well. It represents, I don't know the answer. I can guess as well as anybody else. I think what Rome represents, possibly, I'll just throw something out, but I'm thinking on the spot. What bothers the Gemara about Rome actually is it pretends to be civilized. That's what bothers the Gemara. It's the civilization, they build the roads, and it said the bridges and the roads, etc. But there's something barbaric, the Colosseum, the having people, these spectacles of people being killed by the law, whatever. That bothers the Gemara tremendously. And comparing them to the pig is very interesting, because the pig, which we think of as the ultimate animal that's not kosher, what's unique about the pig is for an animal to be kosher, there are two signs it has. It chews its cud, it has cleft feet. The pig is one of the few animals that has cleft feet, but it doesn't chew its cud, which the Gemara understands as it has all the outer signs. It's totally kosher outwardly, because you can see the feet, but you can't really tell if it chews its cud. So it's a kind of inner corruption, but the civilized person who is actually degraded. And perhaps, I'm just guessing, when you think of Shlomo in terms of the presentation of Shlomo, both in the book of Melachim, especially in the book of Melachim, and also through Shlomo's writings, at least the writings that are ascribed to him, whether it's Kohelet, there's three books that are ascribed to Shlomo. We'll discuss that briefly. There's Kohelet, there's Mishlei, and there's Shir Hashirim. Two of them fall squarely into what we would call wisdom literature. And in fact, wisdom literature, one of the things that is central to wisdom literature is that it is universal. It's about universal truths. It's about human conduct. So I think that, Shlomo is the civilized person. Shlomo is the man of the world who is very big, who connects to all kinds of, and he's wiser than all the wise people of different cultures. So there's a side to Shlomo that can be read as the civilized person. And I think the critique over here then, if that be the case, is saying when he first thing he does, he marries Pharaoh's daughter, and the emphasis that we saw last week, and we'll see more of it presumably, it was the drinking last week. He's up all night partying. It's the drinking, it's the excess of Shlomo that strikes the Talmud, I think, generally speaking, as very problematic. So that it is true that, as someone just commented on the chat, that the marriages can be seen as actually political alliances. He has 1,000 wives, right? So yes, it could be that these are political I know no doubt about it. But the Gemara's presentation, which is at this point interesting to us, about the wild parties, one might say the drunken parties in which he was sleeping on top of the temple keys. I think perhaps that's why Rome is brought in. I would say that the Talmud in general does not have a high regard for the civilization of Rome. They recognize the bridges and the roads, they got all that. There's something about Rome which bothers the Talmud. And there's something about the church which bothers the Talmud as well, with the institution of the church. So I would say that's my guess about Rome. The question is well taken though. Yes, someone else had a question or comment.
Can I say that I think the word Rome is added in parentheses? How you say this in English? It's added, the word Rome. Do I recall from the sheet that it says Akrach HaGadol and Rome appears in as an option?
I don't remember. It's possible.
So it might mean that not all manuscripts mention the word Rome.
Could be. At least the question is about the ones that do. I mean, it's possible, but it wouldn't surprise me here. It's about, but the larger point. I do think that Rome is here basically because of the temple. Rome is the story of the second temple, and the Medrash isn't that bothered by one temple or the other. But the idea of it is that the behavior is such to call into question the very temple that Shromo is known for. And we will end in the last session or two. I didn't want to get back to the biblical text about Shlomo, the builder of the temple, which I think is very powerful. And it makes Shlomo a sort of much more interesting character. But we'll get to that later. There was one other person who had a question, comment.
Would you agree, Rabbi Silber, that it has some sense of Shlomo as a founding father of Rome, paradoxically? Because he's the one to found the city, or I don't understand the text correctly.
No, I don't know if he's founding the city, but I think that, it's a good question. What is a specific image of Gabriel coming down and in the middle of the sea, building something that becomes the sort of the platform for the Roman Empire? I don't know. I haven't really thought about it, so I'll have to say it's a good question. I'll think about what the specific image is. But it fits in with one of the main points I was pushing for, which is that in a certain sense, David's kingdom never is fully realized within the biblical text. It remains a kind of messianic ideal. Mm-hmm. And I would add to this point about the very name Shlomo itself. In other words, the text, for example, we saw last week that when Shlomo is finishing his temple, and he wants to bring the ark into the temple, and the gates refuse to open for him. They suspect him. Mihuze Melech HaKavod, and they're asking him, which king of glory are you talking about? They think he's talking about himself. So they won't open up until finally he invokes David's name, Bavru David Abdecha, and the gates open. And what they're picking up on, I think, and maybe we'll get back to this later, is that from one perspective, Shlomo is, from the very name Shlomo, Shalem. Shlomo is a completion of David's idea. David himself can't be the builder of the temple, either in the book of Chronicles or Kings. He has the concept, he has the idea. In Chronicles, he even works with the architectural plans. But Shlomo is the builder. Shlomo is the completion of David's kingship on one hand. But on the other hand, even before he builds the temple, the kingship is sort of doomed. So it means that David's kingship was never fully recognized or realized, at least in the version of Kings. It's never came to real fruition. So it sort of remains a kind of messianic ideal. But the very name Shlomo is interesting because the name Shlomo, on one hand, you have by the way, the text plays with this. The text we just saw. V'lo hayal livavo shalem ki levav David aviv. His name may be Shlomo, but he's not Shalem. His father David, with a very different name, he was Shalem, at least according to Kings, not in the book of Shmuel, but he's Shalem. But Shlomo is not Shalem. And then the other meaning of Shlomo is related to the word Shalom. it says explicitly in the book of Chronicles that his name will be Shromo, he'll be a man of peace, and he will be the builder of the temple. David says about himself, I can't build the temple, I'm a man of war. So the name Shlomo both represents, in the positive sense, a completion, a fullness, a wholeness, and also represents the idea of peace, and that these two things, I presume, come together. That the idea of completion, which in the biblical narrative, what represents completion of God's plan is actually the temple. The temple represents the completion. God created the world, we're banished from Eden, and the temple represents a return to a kind of alternate Eden. That's the idea of the temple. And that is combined with the idea of peace, true peace. And it's interesting, by the way, just as a thought, and I want to move on to the next point, is that in our very prayers, the way we have our prayers, which is the Amidah, the Shemona Esrei, so we end, how do we end our daily service? How do we end the Amidah? So the last blessing of the Amidah, Sim Shalom, right? Sim Shalom is the last blessing. It's a prayer for peace. Sim Shalom Tova Vracha. But Sim Shalom, actually, and this is it's good to know this sort of cultural literacy. The blessing of Sim Shalom is actually a synopsis of Birkat Kohanim. In fact, the Ashkenazim say Sim Shalom at a time when you could have Birkat Kohanim, the priestly blessing. The custom outside the land of Israel was that the priestly blessing is not recited every day, but the custom, for whatever reason, it's a mystery why, the custom in Israel is that the priestly blessing is recited every day and twice on Shabbat. And so you're actually, and the priestly blessing is the vestige that we have of the temple service. So there you have in your Amidah, at the end of the Amidah, beginning with the blessing called Ritzei, which they call Avoda, it talks about a return to the temple worship, which is called Avoda. And in the context of temple worship, the last piece of the daily Amidah, it ends with Birkat Kohanim, the priestly blessing, which was a temple service. And the prayer that is said after the priestly blessing, Sim Shalom, is essentially a commentary on the priestly blessing. For example, the second blessing talks about God's countenance light. Yo'er Hashem panav elecha v'chuneka. God should bring you light. Yo'er Hashem, God should shine God's face upon you and be gracious to you. And we have in Sim Shalom, Bi'ar panecha, ki bi'ar panecha natata lanu Hashem Elokeinu, Torah chayim v'yavat chesed. It talks about God's light, God's shining face. That's the blessing. Blessing of Sim Shalom is simply a commentary on Birkat Kohanim. So there we have it in our prayer service. There we have the idea that our prayers, our aspirations, are, of course, for peace. We always end with peace. But peace and temple come together in the daily service. And that's the very name Shromo. It's what Shromo might have been. Shlomo with a sense of shalem, completion, which in thinking, one might say Jewish myth, and certainly within our liturgy, we're always praying for the temple. That's our aspiration, whether you want a temple or don't want a temple, but you're praying for the temple. And of course, we pray for peace. And the two of them come together, actually. So that's what Shlomo might have been. Of course, in the book of Kings, it doesn't work. And the point of the Gemara in Shabbat is, it doesn't work even before he's truly the king. It's already been undercut. Those that will destroy the temple are already created, or the platform for temple destruction was created when he marries Pharaoh's daughter. But the marriage to Pharaoh's daughter is verse number 1 about Shlomo, after he assumes the throne. Okay, that's the first point I wanted to make.
Is it connected to Melchizedek Melech Shalem, who's...
I would certainly connect it to Melchizedek Melech Shalem. I think that's an excellent point. And there you have a wonderful example, because Melchizedek Melech Shalem is not just a king. Melchizedek, just for those who don't remember, he's the king who greets Abraham after Abraham has defeated the 4 kings, which I've explained on other occasions. Abraham's defeat of the 4 kings in chapter 14 is a symbolic conquest of the land of Canaan. So after Abraham has conquered symbolically the land of Canaan, which means he has conquered one of the places that is the alternative to Eden, the place in which God can dwell. So this mysterious righteous king, Melchizedek, comes out to greet him. But Melchizedek is not just a king. The text says in Sefer Bereshit, chapter 14, V'hu kohen le'el elyon. He's not just a king, he's also a priest. He's a kohen, and in point of fact, when Melchizedek comes to greet Abraham after his victory, what does he bring him? Melchizedek melech shalem hotzi lechem v'yayin. He brought him bread and he brought him wine. It's interesting, he doesn't bring him what we would expect him to bring, bread and water. Normally it's bread and water, right? Ammon and Moab didn't bring you lechem and mayim when you left Egypt. Bread and water. Those are the basic necessities. That which sustains you is the bread, and you need water. But Melchizedek doesn't bring bread and water, he brings bread and wine. Bread and wine is sacramental, right? Bread and wine can be sacred food. Wine is poured on the altar. Bread is sacrificial. The carbon mincha, etc., and other carbonot as well. So therefore, he appears as priest and also as king. And it's very interesting, and I don't want to get into this, about can the king be also a priest? That's an interesting question. But my point is that Melech Shalem, which may or may not be Yerushalayim, but it certainly is a positive word, Shalem. And there you have it. He comes as priest to recognize the fact that Abraham has successfully done God's work in securing the sacred space in which God and the human being can interact, which is the land of Canaan and also the temple later. Those are the 2 alternative sacred spaces. So there you have the one who's coming out is a king who's also a priest. In the case of Shlomo, he's not a priest, but he's a builder of the space in which the priest can function. So the point about Melchizedek Melech Shalem is an excellent point. It dovetails perfectly with what Shlomo might have been. But of course, the Agadah here makes the point that he has nobody but himself to blame, because the first thing he does is taking the daughter of Paro.
I must add that they just found in Yerushalayim the Mikdash of Melchizedek.
Really? This is
really just
okay.
lately.
And didn't know he had one, but okay.
Yes.
He is a very, Melchizedek is a very interesting character. I can't get into this now, both within our tradition and within the Christian traditions about Melchizedek. It's a very interesting topic, but we'll have to leave it at this for now. In any event, okay, so that's the first point I wanted to make. Let's see, is there anything more in this particular Gemara? No, let's just scroll down a little more. Let's see. Where is this text? Let's see. Yes.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be, let's read a little bit more. I think we'll stop. Now, we'll stop at this point. We'll stop with this text for now. I wanted to go back to a different, I want to go to a different text. It's at the end of this document, there's a Gemara in Masechet Eruvin, Daf Kaf Aleph. Okay? Go to the bottom, Noah, of the text. It's Eruvin Daf Kaf Aleph. All the way in the bottom, I believe it's the last text. Yes. Very end, it's what number would be? It's on page 14, it says. 14. Eruvin 21b. Okay. So let me just say a few words about Eruvin 21b. Okay? Can you all hear me, by the way?
Yes.
Yes, you can. Okay, fine. Okay, so Eruvin 21b, the context, this is a Gemara in Masechet Eruvin. So let me just say one word about that. So Eruvin and Eruv, there are 3 kinds of Eruv that we have. but an Eruv is the following. So on Shabbat, it's for one of the things that's forbidden to do on Shabbat is to carry from the public domain to the private domain, or from the private domain to the public domain. It is permissible to carry from a private domain to a different private domain, but the rabbis of old forbade that. They were afraid if they permit that, people will carry from the public domain to the private, etc. It's forbidden. Having said it's forbidden, they also, under certain circumstances, allowed it to take place through a fiction called Eruv Chatzerot. So let's say many houses open to a common courtyard, as it probably was common in times of the Talmud. And if the people in the courtyard all chip in and buy some food, let's say some bread, and put it in the house of one of the owners of one of the houses that opens into the courtyard, then the fiction is that everybody lives in that one house. It's not different private domains, but one domain. And that permits that the people whose houses open to the courtyard to carry from one house to the next. And that is, it permits everybody to carry within this courtyard. The courtyard becomes the domain of one entity, not different entities. That's called Eruv Chatzerot. The Gemara in Eruvin, which is very interested in Eruv Chatzerot, talks about another rabbinic enactment which allows people, which is also which is a rabbinic enactment. It's not required, and that is the practice of washing one's hands before one eats bread, before one eats a meal. Netilat Yadayim. So the Gemara here talks about Netilat Yadayim and the great importance of Netilat Yadayim. It starts, the beginning of the Gemara has a story about Rabbi Akiva was in prison, and they would bring him food every day, and they bring him water. And he would use the water, part of that to wash his hands, and the rest he would drink. So there's a story, I'm not going to get into the story here, it's the first piece of it, on page 15. And one day the guard prevented him from bringing all the water, and Rabbi Akiva refused to drink the water. He uses the water to wash his hands. And see from the bottom of page 15, here it says in English, he says, so the one who's attending him, Rabbi Yoshua, says, I don't have enough water. The water that I brought will not suffice for drinking. Will it suffice? How can it suffice for washing your hands? Right? So Rabbi Akiva answers him, says, what can I do? You see this, so what can I do? He says, because the rabbis have insisted, the rabbi said, one who eats without washing hands is liable to receive the death penalty. Doesn't actually mean the death penalty. It means it's a very serious thing. It's a rabbinic obligation. I'd rather die than transgress the opinion of my colleagues. Okay. When they heard about the story, the sages said, look how meticulous he is, look how observant he is as an old man. You can imagine what he was like when he was young. Okay, fine. So this comes up in the context of the Gemara in Masechet Eruvin, which is all about rabbinic enactments. In the case of the Eruv Chatzerot, it's an enactment to allow you to carry from one private domain to another, which actually from the Torah is permissible. But the rabbis made it forbidden, and then the Eruv makes it permissible. And in this context, it talks about a different rabbinic enactment called Netilat Yadayim. Now, if you look at the way, towards the end of this source, okay? Mm-hmm. So the English is, but I'll read the English over here. Rabbi Yehuda said that Rabbi Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, right? You have it in the Hebrew too. Bishar Shetikain, you want to move the text over to the side? I can't see it actually. At the time that King Solomon instituted the ordinance of Eruv, of courtyards, and of washing hands to purify them from impurity, which are added safeguards to the words of the Torah, so a voice came down from heaven and said in praise of Shromo, So my son, right? Im chacham libcha. If your heart is wise, my heart will be glad. Even my heart will be glad. And it says in regards to Shlomo, my son, be wise and make my heart glad, that I may respond to he who taunts me. So they quote a verse from Mishlei, that's a book that's ascribed to Shlomo. The two verses that are cited are verses from Sefer Mishlei. So here we have the Gemara, it's interesting, ascribes two different, I would say, halachic enactments to Shlomo HaMelech. It's not in the text at all, but the two things they ascribe to him are, number one, Eruv Chatzerot, and number two, they ascribe to him the practice of Netilat Yadayim. Netilat Yadayim is a little more complicated because the Gemara says there were different stages, different takanot, but Shlomo does the first takana. His takana was anybody who eats sacred food has to wash their hands. See, the hands basically, the rabbinic understanding is that the hands can't become ritually impure in and of themselves. But there's a rabbinic enactment that the hands have a special category called Tumat Yadayim. And Shlomo said that when it comes to what's called Kodshim, the hands are considered impure unless you wash the hands first. So, but we give credit to Shlomo for inaugurating this whole concept of washing hands before one eats, which segues into ultimately even a plain old meal that's not sacred food, that's not kodshim, that's not truma, one still must wash one's hands. So we have two things ascribed to Shlomo as one who institutes laws in Israel. And now we have one third thing that's also ascribed to Shlomo in the Talmud, and that's the next source. That's the Gemara in Masechet Brachot and Daf Memchet Amud Bet. So I'll read the Gemara of Nachman. So now we have the Gemara in Brachot. That chapter deals with Birkat HaMazon. So the blessing after you had a meal. So Amar of Nachman, Moshe Tikenu Yisrael Birkat Hazon. Moshe was the one who wrote the text of the first blessing of Birkat HaMazon. Hazana Tolam Chulo B'Tuvo, Hazana Takol. Moshe was the one who wrote that text. Okay, when the man came down from heaven. Yoshua Tikenu Lahem Birkat Haaretz. Yoshua was the one who wrote the second blessing of the Birkat HaMazon. That's called Birkat Haaretz. Begins with Nodelecha Hashem Elokeinu. And the blessing ends with Ala Haaretz V'Al HaMazon. That was Yoshua, because he was the one who led the conquest of the land. So that's the second blessing. Then we get to the third blessing of Birkat HaMazon. It says, David Tikain, King David, he was the one who set up the third blessing. It says, Rachem Hashem Elokeinu, Al Yisrael Amecha, V'Al Yerushalayim Yirecha.
You skipped something.
Excuse me?
You skipped a sentence.
I did. What did I skip? Okay, but David Shlomo. No, I'll get to Shlomo. Okay, right. True. I intentionally. Okay. David Shlomo tiknu b'nei Yerushalayim. So David and Solomon together, they wrote the text for the third blessing. David tikain al Yisrael amecha v'al Yerushalayim yirecha. David wrote the first part of the text. Ushlomo tikain al habayit hagadol v'hakadosh shenikra shimcha alav. So Shlomo completed the text of the blessing, because after all, Jerusalem in Jewish tradition is two different things. Jerusalem is the city of Jerusalem. It's a city, it's the capital of Israel. That's one aspect of Yerushalayim. Then there's another side to Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the temple. Jerusalem is actually the Beit HaMikdash. The actual main building is in a part of Jerusalem, but the entire city of Jerusalem has the status of temple. For example, eating certain sacrifices may be eaten in Jerusalem and only in Jerusalem, not outside Jerusalem. So David was the builder of the city of Jerusalem, and Shlomo is the builder of the temple of Jerusalem. So now we have something interesting about Shlomo. That's our topic here, Shlomo. So now we have a third thing that Shlomo does. The Netilat Yadayim is one. The text of the third blessing of Birkat HaMazon is number 2. And number 3 is Eruv Chatzerot, the legal fiction that we put a loaf of bread in the house of one person who lives in a house that opens to a common space. Private houses open to a common space, which is also a private space. It's not a public space. Doesn't come into the category of public space for whatever reason. Not enough people, not big enough, etc. Not the right size. So we have 3 things that the Talmud ascribes to Shromo. I just wanted to reflect for a moment on these ascriptions to Shromo. There's no evidence whatsoever that he did any of these things, but the Gemara is making the claim, so obviously he's trying to say something about Shromo. So let's understand. So 2 of the 3 are obviously connected to each other. One of them is washing hands before you eat, and the other is saying Birkat HaMazon after you eat. They're clearly connected to each other. And here, there's something very interesting about ascribing this to Shlomo. In other words, the idea of washing before you eat, okay? The Gemara elsewhere says the source for washing before you eat is V'hit kadishtem v'yitem kadoshim. Sanctify yourself and make yourself holy. And the Gemara comments, the first is to wash your hands before you eat, and the second is to wash your hands after you eat, what's known as mayim achronim, which many people still have that practice, whatever the basis of it is. But the Gemara's one view in the Talmud is that it's about sanctifying yourself. So eating is not something ordinarily we might consider a sacred act. So the idea of netilat yadayim is to sanctify the food that we eat. And what's interesting is that the Talmud elsewhere speaks about Shlomo's, and the Book of Kings speaks about Shlomo's meals. And Shlomo's meals are considered to be sumptuous meals. There's an expression, for example, let's say, for example, when Tisha B'Av falls on Saturday night, falls on Sunday. So we know before Tisha B'Av starts generally, you have what's called a Suda HaMafseket. You have a very sparing meal. Sometimes it's accustomed to eat it sitting on the ground, an egg, whatever. Shouldn't have two cooked things together. But if it falls right after Shabbat, so the Gemara says you don't have to have that practice on Shabbat. You can eat for the third meal before Tisha B'Av, afil kisudat Shlomo b'shato. That's an expression that appears many times. You can eat a meal that Shlomo would have eaten, which means a gigantic, sumptuous meal, even a gigantic meal like Shlomo. So apparently, he was known not only for having 1,000 wives and spending 13 years building his house, but he is also known for having quite extravagant meals as well. So that's on one hand. On the other hand, he's the one who institutes the blessing that one makes before one eats, namely netilat yadayim. And he's also the one who writes the text of the blessing that you make after you eat, which is the third blessing, which is Bonei Yerushalayim. It's interesting, by the way, before I get to the third practice that he institutes according to the Talmud, which is what's called Eruv Chatzerot, it is interesting to note that here once again in Birkat HaMazon, if we presume that the fourth blessing of Birkat HaMazon, Hatov HaMeitiv, is of a different order, which is a strong possibility, then actually it's interesting when we eat a meal. So I understand the first blessing. God feeds everybody. Hazana Olam. It's a blessing which is universal. It's the most universal blessing we have. God brings food to all humanity. Not just humanity, to the world. Human, animal, etc. That makes sense. And the second blessing is on the land. Because after all, that's where the food comes from. But what about the third blessing, actually? The third blessing is about Yerushalayim. It's about the temple. Bonei Barachamav Yerushalayim. So how does that get into how is that related to what we ate? What is that about? actually. I guess as a question, not that I have an answer. I'm just curious what you think about that. I mean, we say this all the time, but what does Bonei Yerushalayim have to do with the meal? The first two blessings make perfect sense. God is the deliverer of food, and the food comes from the earth. We thank God for the food, we thank God for the earth. But what is this third blessing?
Are we talking about Chulin or about Kodashim? Which
Chulin, the daily grace after meals. If one eats a meal.
So it's not some ritual meal.
No, not at all. Every day. Could eat right now. Eat a bagel and lox, you know?
Yeah, I mean today, but I mean in the temple times.
No. It's not talking about the temple. It's talking about every meal. So, you know, and in the time of the Talmud, they presumably seem to eat 2 meals a day. We'll often have 3. They had 2. But if you have a meal, however you define a meal, it's called bread or whatever. And then afterwards, we are instructed in the 6th chapter of Brachot to thank God for the meal. It's called Birkat HaMazon, and it consists of 3 blessings plus a 4th blessing. I'm simply putting it out there. It's nothing to do with Shlomo per se, I don't think, but it is interesting to take note of the fact. I mean, the things we do all the time, and it's good to reflect upon what we do. I think it's useful. Sometimes we even come to a better understanding of it. I'm simply pointing out something, that the Birkat HaMazon is very curious. I mean, you're ending with, I mean, one might say it's the last blessing. It is blessing number 3, if you consider blessing number 3 to be the last blessing. There's another blessing afterwards. But it's safe to say that blessing number 3 is actually the last blessing of Birkat HaMazon, as evidenced by the fact that we say Amen after the blessing. Baruch atah Hashem, bonei berachamav Yerushalayim, Amen. It's the only blessing that Ashkenazim say after their own blessing, because it's the end of a set. The Sephardim say Amen after many sets. The Ashkenazim say Amen only after one set, which is Birkat HaMazon, because there actually is another blessing, but it's not considered to be in its technical sense, part of Birkat HaMazon. So, yes, someone wrote on the chat a very interesting idea, that we have the concept of Shulchan Kemizbeach, that the meal that we're eating, to pick up on Sarah's point, it is a regular plain old meal. But one way to think about food, actually, is to think about food as even the plain food that we're eating, to think of what we're eating as sacred in that it gives us the energy to do what we are commanded to do. So therefore, the idea that the table that we're eating at is a kind of substitute for the altar, that would actually fit in very nicely with this idea that we are recalling the temple, which is what the third blessing is all about. That's one possibility, which is interesting. And the other direction to think about would be about the land. When you talk about the land, so the land always has 2 facets. It's the regular land, the land in which God is present. And within that land, God is very present in certain spaces. We call that the temple or the mikdash or whatever. So perhaps blessing number 3 is simply an extension of sorts of blessing number 2. Be that as it may, it's something to think about. I think it's very interesting that that's what we actually have been handed in terms of Birkat HaMazon. What about the other takana of Shromo according to the Talmud, which is he's the one who sets up what's called Eruv Chatzerot? What is that about? Because the Birkat HaMazon and the Tilat Yadayim can be seen as one piece. But the idea that on Shabbat, he found a way to permit people to carry from one house to the next, from one private domain to the next. What is that actually about?
Is it about the mikdash, like carrying something?
Well, the prohibitions are all rooted in the mikdash. That's true. I think it is about the mikdash in a different sense, and I think this is an important point. The temple is not just a place where you serve God. The temple is actually, one might call it the Jewish center. It is the communal space. And what Shlomo represents, and this is, I think, a very important point about Shlomo. The book of Mishlei begins Divrei Mishlei, Divrei Shromo ben David, Melech Yisrael, which is a very unusual term, Melech Yisrael. He's the king of Israel. David was the king of Israel, and that is the unified kingdom. What the king is about in the positive sense is to unify the nation. That's the role of the king. Afterwards, of course, the nation splits into two pieces after Shlomo's death. We'll get to that not tonight. But a nation divided against itself cannot stand, as Abraham Lincoln said. And but Shlomo is actually the one who represents, and David and Shlomo represent a unified people. The idea of the Eruv Chatzerot, the ability of people to carry from one private domain to the next through the legal fiction that we're all living in the same space. That's the fiction. That is a very Shlomo ordinance, because what it's pointing towards is all of Israel together. This is this Messianic aspiration that one day all of Israel will be together. Actually, the Messianic aspiration of the Rambam is one day the world will be together. Maybe it's also the Beatles that the world will live as one, That's how the Rambam ended his great code. That's where Maimonides ends his code. He puts it in terms of understanding God, of knowledge, because he's the ultimate rationalist, and that's his philosophy, that one connects to God through knowledge, but the world will be filled with the knowledge of God. What the temple is about, among other things, it is the communal space. There may be different tribes, but there's one temple for everybody. So Shlomo, in the positive sense, represents that as well. Let me just take one last moment here to make one point about a text that we saw last week, and then I'll stop and take comments or questions. So I want to make a simple point. Maybe we'll come back to this. I do next week. There's a lot more here, but I did want to start with the demons, since these sessions are called Solomon and his demons. And I want to get to the most famous story about Shlomo, which is Shlomo and the demon. Get to next week, maybe a couple of weeks on that. But let me say one last point about Shlomo. Shlomo was actually unique in the following sense. He is the author of 3 biblical books. He's the subject, a main subject of 2 of them, of Kings and of Chronicles. But he's actually the purported author, at least, of 3 books. One is Mishlei, one is Kohelet, and one is Shir HaShirim. These are the 3 books that are ascribed to Shlomo. Last week, we saw a very interesting story, and we didn't complete the whole thing either. Famous story where they asked someone about, can you put out a candle on Shabbat for a person who's very ill? And before he answers the question in the affirmative, he starts with, oh, Shlomo, where is your wisdom? You say things that contradict your father David, and you say things that contradict yourself. And we saw that. That's how last week's text began. We didn't get to the continuation. It's a long text. But later on, the Gemara makes a comment both about the book of Kohelet, which is ascribed to Shlomo, Kohelet ben David, Melech Yerushalayim, which the Gemara assumes is Shlomo, tells us it's Shlomo. Kohelet is Shlomo. It's one of the names of Solomon. And the book of Proverbs, there it says, Mishlei Shlomo ben David. These are the words of the Proverbs of Shlomo. And both of these books, the Gemara in Shabbat says that there was resistance on part of the rabbis to include them within the canon. Both Kohelet and also Mishlei. And the Gemara in Shabbat at least says they had a problem with both books because the books contain contradictions. Dvarav soterim ze et ze. That was the beginning of the text we saw last week. Oh, Shlomo, where's your wisdom? Not only do you contradict your father, you contradict yourself. So the Gemara there raises questions about Kohelet and about Mishlei. Actually, the 3rd book, the Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim, we all know that the Gemara raises, actually the Mishnah in Masechet Yadayim raises serious questions about whether Shir HaShirim should be considered a sacred book or not. At the end of the day, we follow Rabbi Akiva. It's not just it's holy, it's Kodesh Kodashim, it's the Holy of Holies. But it is interesting that King Solomon, we ascribe to him 3 books in our canon, all three are accepted. Every one of them, the Gemara or Mishnah says flat out, there was resistance to including it within the canon. Two of them, it's easy to understand why, namely Kohelet, which seems to be, one might say, sacrilegious at many points, and Shir HaShirim, which seems to be just a plain out love story, very beautiful book. God is never mentioned in Shir HaShirim. God is mentioned, Elohim is mentioned in Kohelet, but never Hashem. So Mishlei is interesting, that Mishlei seems to be a book of wisdom. But again, the Gemara seems to suggest at one point, maybe it's Solomon's own, thoughts. He's very smart. He's the wisest person. On the other hand, is it divinely sanctioned? Is it a product of divine inspiration or not? At the end of the day, it becomes part of the canon. But it is curious that the Gemara raises questions about all three. Okay, so here's the plan I'll stop at this point. The plan is, there's one, before we get to the demons, I just want to start next week with one other Gemara about Shlomo and about Shlomo's wives. I did want to get to that. And then we will start with the demons beginning next week. I'll take comments or questions now and wish everybody a happy Purim. And okay, let's take comments or questions for a couple of moments. And you can always email me afterwards at dsilber@risha.org if you don't get a chance now to speak up. Okay, do we have any comments or questions?
Rabbi Silber,
Yes.
it seems as if he was, I don't know, in my mind, he rushed to build this Beit HaMikdash, but it seems that the house took a whole lot longer, his own home.
13 years, as opposed to
And the
7,
reason
right?
I'm saying that is because Perek Gimel already is the downfall with taking the Mitzri, so
Yes.
it's a little perplexing,
Right, the Gemara, look, here's the point. When somebody, somebody's going to build a local synagogue and spend 7 years building it, and then going to build his own house and spends 13 years building it, I think our instincts would say if someone who spends 13 years building his own house, and he appears to use the same workers for both, which we'll get to, that's another problem. I think our instincts would say, well, obviously he seems to care a lot more about his own house than he does about the other place. The Gemara, though, takes it exactly the opposite. At least, what they really think, we'll never know. But the Gemara, and this is a very long midrash in the beginning of Shir HaShirim, actually. It talks about a verse about someone who was quick to do his work. And it puts it in terms of he rushed the temple because he was so anxious to build it, and he did it first. So he completed it in 7 years, not because he cares less about the temple, but because he cared more about the temple. But the question you implicitly raise, what does it say about Shlomo, is a very good question. And the truth is, as we've seen already, and we'll see more, I think, next week when we start the main midrash I wanted to do, and the Gemara in Gittin about the demon, the chief demon, Ashmodai, amazing Gemara. The Talmud itself does not shy away from asking very tough, very pointed questions. And I think the Solomon of Kings is a very complex person. So I wanted to present both sides of it. I do want to end on the upbeat note of the Solomon, the temple builder. And he did more than just build the temple. He puts his imprint upon it, I think, in a very powerful and, to my view, a very positive way, but we'll get there. Anybody else for a comment or question? Okay, so we'll stop at this point. So happy Purim, everybody, and we hope next week to start with the one little Gemara first, and then we'll get to the demons next week. Thank you very much.
I would like to thank Rabbi Silber, as always, for an excellent class, and for everyone on Zoom, Facebook, and Drisha Live for being part of our learning community. And of course, yes, a very happy, safe, wonderful Purim, and for those observing the fast, a healthy and meaningful fast. And we hope to see you soon in excellent ongoing and new classes. So be well and good night.